Hey friends, tonight we step back into a world both strange and strangely familiar. A world where beauty was measured not in health or glow, but in fragility, pallor, and the illusion of effortless nobility. Before you get too cozy, maybe settle in with a low light or a quiet fan humming nearby, and allow your mind to drift gently through the dim corridors of history. Let your breath slow, and let's begin this journey together. In the medieval imagination, beauty wasn't about appearing lively or full of energy. On the contrary, the ideal was to resemble someone who had spent most of their life behind heavy curtains, untouched by sunlight, too important, or too delicate, to venture outdoors. A pale face wasn't cause for concern, it was a symbol. It said, without words, I am wealthy enough never to labor. The sun does not know me. Whereas today we might compliment someone for their radiant complexion, hinting at beach vacations or healthy habits, the medieval elite sought the opposite. Tanned skin meant toil, association with the earth, with farming, with sweat and sun. In that world, to appear bronzed was not exotic. It was shameful. It linked you with peasants and field hands. A face untouched by sunlight was a badge of privilege. But to reach this kind of ideal wasn't easy. Nature rarely gives us the porcelain clarity of moonlight. So people took matters into their own hands, often with consequences. Noble women, and sometimes noblemen, resorted to powders and pastes, recipes born more from desperation than science. They applied white lead to their faces, a soft dusting that blurred blemishes but came at a steep cost. Slow, relentless poisoning. The more luminous the skin, the more dangerous the method. There were other tricks. Some soaked cloth in vinegar and pressed it to their skin in hopes of lightening it further. Others ground pearls into fine dust or whipped up egg whites to create a makeshift facial glaze, a treatment that left skin tight and pale, but hardly comfortable. And for those who wanted to take their appearance a step further, veins, delicate, almost translucent blue, were painted onto arms and collarbones, simulating the kind of skin so thin and fragile it seemed one breath from breaking. Literature joined the chorus. Poets praised lovers as pale as lilies, white as milk, their skin like new snow under a winter moon. This was not just admiration, it was code. In a time when class and power were often hidden behind etiquette, the complexion said what a noble woman could not. I do not work, I do not sweat, I am ethereal, pure, and set apart. To maintain this illusion required devotion. Beauty wasn't effortless. It was an art of self-destruction, and often a very expensive one. But in the pursuit of the perfect pallor, medieval elites showed that the definition of beauty was not just aesthetic. It was social, spiritual, and deeply political. Even in the quiet privacy of one's chambers, the desire to appear aristocratic dictated what one wore, how one painted, and even how one suffered. And that's just the beginning. Among the many odd fascinations of medieval beauty, none raised more eyebrows, quite literally, than the pursuit of the perfect forehead. In a time when high birth was associated with high brows, the forehead was no longer a boundary between face and scalp. It became a canvas, a symbol, and in some cases, a battleground. The ideal look wasn't content with nature's proportions. Instead, it demanded a forehead so wide and bare it seemed to stretch endlessly upward, a smooth and luminous expanse that hinted at piety, intelligence, and aristocratic grace. To achieve this, women didn't simply tidy their brows. They erased them. Eyebrows were plucked until they vanished or shaved away with knives, pumice stones, or homemade depilatory pastes, some containing ingredients best left forgotten, like quicklime, cat feces, or vinegar-drenched leeches. Yes, leeches. And this was no light grooming. It was a full-fledged campaign to push the hairline back, to clear the face of any hint of wildness or natural rebellion. Women removed not just brows, but hair from the tops of their heads, inch by inch, to create the illusion of a longer, nobler skull. This wasn't just about beauty, it was about looking educated, devout, and contemplative. Like someone who spent her days reading scripture by candlelight, not toiling in kitchens or fields. The higher the forehead, the more refined the soul was believed to be. The result? Portraits from the period show serene women gazing out from beneath vast, gleaming foreheads. Their expressions are calm, almost holy. Their faces blanketed in pale powder, smooth and unbroken, framed by veils or tall cone-shaped hats that lifted the gaze ever upward. The eyebrows, those stubborn little arches of expression, were banished. In their place, silence and skin. For those without the time or courage to pluck themselves into perfection, trickery came into play. Women painted their foreheads higher than they truly were, disguising the real hairline beneath cleverly draped veils or elaborate hoods. It was a medieval version of contouring, only instead of makeup palettes and soft lighting, they used fabric, shadows, and sheer determination. Eyebrows weren't just overlooked. They were treated as facial weeds, symbols of disorder, of unnecessary nature intruding on cultivated beauty. To have visible brows was to invite judgment, especially for women of status. And so, with tweezers, razors, and caustic potions, they were removed. Some even went so far as to use arsenic, despite the known risks. In the pursuit of elegance, mild chemical burns were seen as a small price to pay. After all, this was an era when devotion to beauty, to God, to class, often meant enduring discomfort with a calm face and silent compliance. But the no-brow look wasn't universal. In some corners of Europe, contact with other cultures through trade and war brought new influences. Thin, arched brows returned in places touched by Byzantine or Islamic styles. Still, for many centuries, the bare forehead remained the mark of noble beauty. Interestingly, this trend wasn't only a woman's burden. Men, particularly those circling royal courts, sometimes joined in the grooming rituals. They might not shave their brows entirely, but they trimmed them, sculpted them, refined their faces to reflect not masculinity, but manners. Because in the end, medieval beauty was not about looking natural. It was about looking controlled, composed, a curated vision of serenity and superiority. And in that vision, a face without eyebrows whispered of holiness, class, and otherworldly grace. Angels in art rarely had brows. Coincidence? Perhaps. But it was a standard many aspired to. In a world so devoted to the art of appearing pale and untouched, a curious contradiction emerged, the subtle desire for color. Not the bronzed hues of laborers or the sunlit complexions of travelers, but a whisper of pink, a trace of warmth in the cheeks, just enough to suggest life, youth, and quiet allure. This was not a glow earned by exercise or good health. No, medieval blush had to appear accidental. The ideal was a kind of gentle embarrassment, the flush one might get from hearing a suggestive poem or catching the eye of a handsome courtier across the room. A delicate rose tint was the visual equivalent of a sigh. It suggested purity and vitality, but never passion. But applying blush was a delicate business. Too little, and it had no effect. Too much, and it became suspicious, or worse, scandalous. The church kept a watchful eye on such things. Vanity was a sin, after all, and to be caught smearing pigments on your face could raise questions about your soul, not just your taste. Yet women found ways. They always have. In villages and cities alike, they experimented in kitchens and gardens, crushing berries, simmering roots, distilling petals. Beet juice, crushed strawberries, the juice of mulberries. These were nature's paints, applied with care and hope. One popular ingredient, cochineal, came from tiny insects ground into a brilliant red powder. It was expensive, vivid, and entirely composed of crushed life. Some women pinched or slapped their own cheeks for a quick burst of blood beneath the skin. Others, with a bit more cunning, dabbed on wine sediment, red ochre, or even rust mixed into oil or egg. The goal was the same, to look naturally flushed, but not suspiciously so. For the wealthy, the ingredients turned deadly. Red lead and cinnabar became popular among the upper classes, offering richer hues and longer-lasting effects. But these substances, beautiful as they were, carried poisons. The slow erosion of health, the fatigue, the sores, the feverish glow, became part of the aesthetic. Beauty had a cost, and for some it was paid out in years, not coins. Applying this rouge was often done in secret. Mirrors were rare, so women relied on muscle memory, candlelight, or a trusted servant to guide their hands. Some used cloth, others fingers, and some whatever was lying around. A spoon, a bit of wood, even a comb if nothing better presented itself. Publicly, a woman might deny everything. If someone commented on her rosy complexion, the expected response was modesty, even deflection. "It's the cold," she might say. Or, "I've just come from prayer." To admit to painting one's face was to flirt with scandal. The line between elegance and impropriety was perilously thin. Even within cloisters, the desire for beauty found its way. Nuns, forbidden from vanity, were rumored to wear the faintest dab of color on feast days, a reminder that holiness need not be entirely without charm. Beneath all this was the truth medieval women lived with. To be seen as beautiful was power, and power came with risk. A touch of rouge could elevate your place in society, or cast you into suspicion. One had to navigate carefully. The world was watching, and the rules were always shifting. So, with berries and beetles, minerals and prayers, women painted life into their faces. Not to deceive, but to survive in a system that demanded they be both lovely and invisible, radiant and modest, ethereal but not vain. If skin was the canvas upon which medieval beauty was painted, then hair was the golden thread that wove through the entire aesthetic. It wasn't just a physical feature. It was a story, a social signal, and at times, a sacred ornament. For women in medieval Europe, hair was both a blessing and a burden, praised, hidden, manipulated, and even weaponized by the standards of the time. Above all, there was one color that reigned supreme: blonde. Not the natural golden variety found under the sun in Scandinavian forests, but a more symbolic blondness, the kind associated with divinity, purity, and youthful grace. Artists painted saints with golden strands even if their real-world counterparts would have been far darker in hue. The Virgin Mary herself, born in a land of deep olive tones, was often reimagined with a crown of sunlit hair. Not because it was accurate, but because it was ideal. To be born blonde was to be born lucky, but nature rarely sustains what fashion demands. As children grew into adulthood, the brightness faded. And so, women turned to alchemy and sunlight to restore what time took away. They created potions from chamomile, saffron, ash, and honey, smearing the sticky mixtures onto their heads and baking themselves under the open sky, a method called sunbasking. The process required patience, dedication, and a remarkable tolerance for discomfort. Some even added urine to the mix, trusting in the strange logic of their age that such an addition might unlock divine brilliance. Yet color was only one part of the equation. Texture and style mattered too. Loose, cascading waves, long and slightly wild, were considered the height of unmarried beauty. They suggested freedom, fertility, a connection to nature. A maiden's hair, untamed and uncovered, was a kind of living poem. But once a woman married, this freedom ended. Her hair was veiled, bound, and carefully concealed from public view. To the medieval mind, a married woman's hair was no longer just hair. It was modesty, morality, and propriety, something private, something to be shielded. Thus began a lifetime of layering. First a coif, a snug linen cap, then a veil, perhaps a wimple, wrapping beneath the chin. The effect was architectural, a structure of fabric that transformed the head into a sign of virtue. Some women looked like beautifully wrapped parcels of piety, their golden locks hidden beneath folds of solemn linen. But not all coverings were plain. As fashion evolved, so did the headgear. Veils were embroidered. Nets were stitched with gold thread. Tiny bells adorned the silken cages that held braided hair in place. Some women jingled when they turned their heads. Not loudly, but just enough to remind everyone in the room that while their hair might be hidden, it was most certainly worth noticing. Hair, when it appeared, was never accidental. A single escaped curl could be a calculated risk. A translucent veil, technically obeying the rules but practically revealing everything, was a clever loophole, a way of saying, "Yes, I'm covered," while inviting admiration all the same. These subversions were subtle, but they mattered. In a world where rules governed not only behavior but appearance, even the smallest rebellion spoke volumes. Men, too, paid attention to hair. While their grooming wasn't as heavily policed, a nobleman's locks were often styled, scented, and curled. Poetry praised warriors with flowing hair, and knights were painted with wind-blown manes like holy lions. Still, for men, hair was less a moral issue and more a matter of lineage and image. A thick, well-kept head of hair suggested youth, strength, and courtly manners, all desirable traits whether at the feast or the front line. But for women, hair was tied to everything, to virtue, to temptation, to status. To let it flow freely after marriage was to risk being mistaken for a harlot. To cut it was a sign of mourning, or worse, of punishment. In convents, hair was shorn to symbolize the shedding of earthly vanity. In courts, it was gilded and perfumed to suggest divine favor. In the end, hair in the medieval world wasn't just hair. It was identity, wielded carefully in a culture obsessed with appearances and meanings. Whether concealed beneath fabric or coaxed into shimmering curls, it served not just as decoration, but as declaration. As medieval ideals of beauty reached new heights, quite literally, fashion followed suit. By the 15th century, the nobility of Europe had developed a particular fascination with verticality, not of stature, but of silhouette. The taller the headdress, the more noble the woman. And nothing embodied this skyward obsession more than the hennin. The hennin was not merely a haint, it was a statement, an architectural feat perched delicately on the head, often resembling an inverted cone, like a church spire dipped in silk. Some stretched 2 feet high or more, defying gravity and good sense, supported by wire frames and wrapped in fine fabrics. These towering creations were not practical. That was precisely the point. To wear a hennin was to declare that you did not work, did not run, did not need to move quickly or duck through doorways. You were not a servant or a tradeswoman. You were nobility. And the hat made sure everyone knew it. From the courts of Burgundy to the salons of Paris, these cone-shaped marvels became a kind of wearable hierarchy. The taller the hennin, the higher the status of the wearer. They were often adorned with sheer veils, flowing like banners from the peak, adding an ethereal shimmer to every movement. In candlelight, the floating fabric created a halo-like glow. In wind or rain, they were a disaster. But again, the wearer wasn't expected to endure such vulgar elements. But the hennin was just one part of a broader vertical fantasy. Some women wore heart-shaped escoffions, padded frames that curled outward like wings or croissants. Others favored butterfly henins, with veils stretched into wide winged spans, fluttering behind them as they walked. These weren't hats. They were architecture for the head, and beneath them hair was braided, stuffed, or even removed to make room. Yes, removed, in order to fit these contraptions properly, and to emphasize that all-important forehead, many women shaved the front of their scalps. The forehead, already a prized facial real estate, now became a landing zone for elaborate millinery. Comfort was never the goal. Dignity, height, and spectacle were the rewards. And if the hennin created the illusion of towering grace, the rest of the wardrobe worked in harmony. Tight-fitting hoods, veils, and wimples framed the face and extended the line of the neck and jaw. Layers of linen and silk pulled everything upward and inward, as if the entire body aspired to be less earthly and more divine. Outside of the nobility, styles were simpler, if no less symbolic. Peasant women wore linen caps, veils tied at the back, or circlets, small bands that hinted at the fashion of the elite without risking social confusion. Theirs was a quieter beauty, dictated not by the whims of court, but by the necessities of daily life. The church, ever the voice of cautious moderation, occasionally objected. These hats, they warned, were too extravagant. They invited pride, a dangerous sin. Worse, they encouraged vanity, a moral decay dressed in velvet and jewels. But such objections did little to stop the trend. The hennin persisted, growing ever taller, ever more elaborate, until the towers themselves became a kind of satire. Meanwhile, men had their own forms of fashionable absurdity. Feathered caps, fur-trimmed hoods, and pointy shoes that curled like question marks. Their silhouettes exaggerated shoulders and narrowed waists, echoing the same ideals of control, poise, and social polish. But nothing they wore ever quite reached the celestial aspirations of the hennin, because for women of the court, beauty had to be seen from a distance, elevated, unattainable. And if that meant wearing a 2-foot cone on your head held in place by pins, prayers, and powdered ambition, so be it. The higher the hat, the closer to grace. In the medieval imagination, a beautiful woman did not stride confidently or radiate physical power. She drifted, she wafted. She gave the impression of being half lost in thought or freshly recovered from a fainting spell. Her body, like her manners, was meant to suggest softness, a gentleness of form that reflected her place in the social order, ornamental, obedient, untouchable. The ideal figure was not athletic, it was not voluptuous, it was not muscular, toned, or ready for action. Instead, it was willowy and serene, a silhouette that hinted at poetry and prayer rather than fertility or vigor. A slender waist was prized, but not so much for the sake of desire. It was about control, refinement, and the illusion of spiritual elevation. The less grounded the body appeared, the closer to virtue it seemed. To enhance this impression, clothing played its part. Gowns were designed with high waistlines, often just below the bust, elongating the torso and allowing the fabric to fall freely in flowing lines. This early version of the empire waist created the effect of height and grace. Layers of soft fabric disguised any unwanted shapes, turning the wearer into a kind of gentle statue. Where nature did not cooperate, artifice stepped in. Women bound their waists with girdles or tightly laced garments. Not quite corsets, as we would know them later, but enough to narrow the midsection and suggest a certain fragility. These weren't garments built for comfort or movement. They were meant to sculpt the body into submission, to display restraint even in posture. But thinness had its limits. In times of famine and plague, the too thin body became a warning sign, not an aspiration. A slight roundness in the face or hips could suggest health and fertility, signs of strength in a world where both were often in short supply. The sweet spot was balance, slim but not sickly, delicate but not wasted. What passed for beauty advice in those days often read more like herbology. Manuals might suggest eating fennel to calm the stomach, rose petals to freshen the breath, or sipping wine to brighten the complexion. Protein? Acceptable, if it still had feathers. Hearty meals were for the working classes. Nobility preferred something lighter, more symbolic, a life lived on honey water and sighs. Of course, men lived by a different rule book. A nobleman was allowed more presence, more mass, though still controlled. He might have broad shoulders, muscular legs, the stance of someone who could ride or fight, but always wrapped in decorums. Labor built muscle, and muscle suggested common birth. The noblest look was that of a man who might carry a sword, but only ceremonially, and only if the squire wasn't available. The medieval ideal of the female body was a kind of vanishing act. It wasn't about what you could do. It was about what you could endure without ever seeming to try. It was about being seen and not heard, admired but not approached, loved, perhaps, from a safe and silent distance. To be beautiful was to be distant, a painting, not a person, a poem, not a body. And in this vision of beauty, the woman became a whisper, a carefully constructed echo of purity and passivity, gliding through halls of stone and shadow, her physical self as elusive as her social freedom. In the silent theater of medieval beauty, the eyes were the stars, expressive, symbolic, and often the only part of a woman's face allowed to truly speak. While most features were painted, plucked, or covered, the eyes remained a focal point, a space of emotion and mystery in an otherwise rigid aesthetic. To be beautiful in the Middle Ages was to possess eyes that could convey softness, sensitivity, and above all, moral depth. The ideal eye was not narrow or sharp. It was wide, round, and clear, the kind of gaze that suggested innocence, devotion, and an inner life steeped in prayer. Eyes were described in poetry not as seductive but as sacred. They were called dewdrops, orbs of light, pools of virtue. The best eyes didn't merely see. They reflected a soul unburdened by worldly corruption. Color mattered too. In the cooler climates of Northern Europe, light-colored eyes, especially blue and gray, were often preferred, seen as signs of purity or divine favor. They implied a kind of untouched grace, as if the bearer had spent her life gazing at holy texts and candle flames rather than braving the harshness of the world. In southern regions, darker eyes were still admired, especially when paired with noble heritage. But the cultural poetry leaned toward the light, the angelic, the heavenly. Enhancing the eyes was no simple task. There were no kohl pencils or mascara wands, just soot, charcoal, and improvisation. Some women dabbed fine black powders near the lashes to make their eyes appear larger or deeper, risking irritation or infection for the sake of beauty. There were no mirrors on every wall, no bathroom lights, just the guesswork of candle-lit reflections and memory. But in many cases, women didn't rely on paint. They relied on light. Standing near a flame gave the eyes a warm shimmer. Lowering the gaze made lashes appear longer. To seem more virtuous, one simply had to look downward, constantly. A modest woman never stared directly. She looked through her lashes, around corners at the floor. The result was a gaze heavy with implication, not confrontation. Even tears had value. Moist eyes, slightly shimmering with emotion, were admired. They suggested spiritual depth, the kind of sorrow born of contemplation, not crisis. A woman who appeared on the verge of weeping, gently, beautifully, might be seen as more pious, more sensitive, more desirable. There were no artificial tears, of course, but smoke could help. A whiff of incense, a smoky room, all could provide the necessary sheen. And yet, too much looking could become dangerous. Prolonged eye contact was bold, flirtatious, or even threatening. A woman who stared might be labeled shameless or improper, especially if her gaze landed on a man of higher status. A sideways glance, a flicker of eye beneath a lowered lid, these were safer, subtler, and far more powerful. Artists of the time understood this well. Medieval portraits often depict women with distant, unfocused stares, their faces calm, their eyes slightly averted. It was the look of grace, the look of someone who had seen sorrow, endured virtue, and chosen silence. In some religious art, even angels were painted without pupils, their eyes pale and unblinking, as though they saw a world beyond this one. In this quiet economy of glances and restraint, a woman's eyes became her most effective language. They could express grief, gratitude, caution, or invitation, all without a word. And for a society so governed by hierarchy and control, that quiet power mattered. Because in the medieval world, beauty wasn't loud. It didn't shout or shimmer. It whispered, and the eyes were where the whisper lived. In the romantic verses of medieval love poetry, a woman's mouth was likened to rosebuds and pearls, her lips described in hues of wine and silk. But what the verses never mentioned, and likely avoided on purpose, was the reality that lay behind those poetic comparisons. Breath. Medieval Europe was a world where dental hygiene was as much aspiration as action, and where the pursuit of a pleasing smile often collided with the stark limitations of the age. There were no toothbrushes in every home, no mouthwash in bottles, and no mint to chew unless you grew it yourself. Yet fresh breath, however elusive, was still a desirable trait. Not for charm, but for civility. A sweet-smelling mouth was a silent sign of youth, health, and good breeding, or at the very least, that you hadn't eaten pickled fish or raw garlic for breakfast. Women, and some men, turned to nature for help. They chewed parsley leaves, fennel seeds, cloves, or cinnamon bark. These herbs weren't just for flavor. They were tiny weapons in the war against odor. Some even chewed on twigs or tree bark, not unlike early versions of chew sticks found in other cultures. These makeshift brushes helped scrape away food residue and masked whatever lingered beneath. For those of higher rank, apothecaries offered herbal pastes or mouth rinses made from sage, vinegar, myrrh, and sometimes honey. They were bitter, occasionally caustic, and certainly expensive. But if one had to whisper secrets into the ear of a noble man, or receive a kiss in a shadowed hallway, it helped to have breath that didn't drive him back toward his goblet. Still, expectations were modest. Toothbrushing, as we understand it, didn't exist. Instead, people wiped their teeth with cloths, rubbed them with salt, chalk, or crushed herbs, and hoped for the best. Teeth-whitening powders made from coral, bone ash, or crushed seashells were used sparingly, not just for effectiveness, but because they were often more abrasive than helpful. Imagine scraping your teeth with sandpaper in hopes of looking virtuous, and yet smiling, especially with teeth, was not in fashion. A wide, open smile was often seen as crude, even vulgar. To show your teeth too often or too broadly was to risk looking foolish or overly familiar. The fashionable smile of the time was a closed one, modest, demure, and slightly wistful. A Mona Lisa before Mona Lisa. Artists captured this aesthetic in paint. Medieval portraits rarely display open mouths. Saints, queens, even angels, all wore serene expressions with lips gently sealed. They looked contemplative, holy, and perhaps tactfully guarded against the risks of exposure. Men were not exempt from the unspoken etiquette of the mouth. A knight might win battles and inspire loyalty, but if he grinned too wide, he might undermine his noble image. After all, who ever sang of a hero's gleaming molars? Troubadours sang of hair, eyes, and hands. Teeth, when mentioned at all, were implied, never described. Even proximity was shaped by the realities of oral hygiene. Lovers conversed at arm's length. Affection was subtle, often silent. In courts and chambers, gestures replaced words, and when conversation drew too close, a well-scented pomander, a small perforated orb filled with herbs, was raised discreetly, waved before the face like a fan, offering a moment of fragrant reprieve. The truth is, medieval people did what they could. They understood the value of a sweet mouth, even if their tools were crude and their results inconsistent. And while they couldn't summon the shine of modern dentistry, they worked with what they had. Leaves, sticks, powders, and an unshakable commitment to appearing elegant, even when the odds were stacked against them. In the medieval world, beauty was not just seen, it was sensed. From across the room, through scent and silence, in the flicker of a glance and the hush of a smile. And sometimes, to remain beautiful was simply to remain just far enough away. In a time when beauty was bound by modesty and the body cloaked in layers of fabric and etiquette, the smile remained perhaps the most revealing, and therefore most dangerous, expression a person could offer. It wasn't because joy was frowned upon, but because teeth were, quite literally, unpredictable. The medieval mouth was not a landscape of gleaming white perfection. Tooth decay was common, even expected, regardless of social class. Bread, porridge, wine, and mead made up much of the diet, and though sugar was rare, the carbohydrates in these foods still fed the bacteria that ate away at enamel. There were no dentists, no toothpaste, no floss, just the slow, inevitable attrition of time. Yet beauty did not abandon the mouth. It simply reshaped how the mouth was used. A smile, if it came, was gentle, close-lipped, almost secretive. The mouth became a vessel for suggestion rather than display, a subtle parting of the lips, a poetic softness rather than a burst of joy. In this era, to grin openly was to risk more than ridicule. It was to expose a truth better left in shadow. Still, care was taken, in whatever form was available. People chewed herbs and rubbed crushed coral, salt, or chalk against their teeth in hopes of scraping away the worst of the stains. Powders were made from sage leaves or charred bones and applied with cloths or even twigs. None of these methods could restore whiteness, but they could soften the evidence of decay. A mouth that didn't offend was the goal. A gleaming smile was the stuff of legend. Mirrors, if available, were small and imperfect. Grooming was largely guided by touch, habit, and the honesty of a servant. For noblewomen, oral care was often as secretive as cosmetics, practiced quietly and mentioned even less. And if teeth began to rot or fall, silence became the best accessory. Artists of the time mirrored this caution. In medieval portraiture, mouths are nearly always closed. Even saints and angels, those paragons of virtue and beauty, wear calm, sealed expressions. The implication is not sadness, but serenity, a composure too dignified for the vulgarity of exposed teeth. In paintings, even laughter becomes an internal affair, expressed in the eyes, the tilt of the head, never the opening of the mouth. Men, too, were not exempt. Though expected to be more rugged, a nobleman was still judged on elegance and restraint. A warrior might bare his teeth in battle, but at court he kept his expressions polite. Ballads were written about shining armor, flowing hair, and piercing gazes, never about smiles. Yet despite all this, there was still admiration for those rare individuals who retained healthy teeth into adulthood. To have even white teeth was not merely a cosmetic advantage. It was a sign of luck, health, perhaps even divine favor. It might not have been celebrated openly, but it was noticed, and so the smile became a performance of control. The best smiles were the ones that revealed nothing, that suggested delight but held back proof. In a culture that prized restraint, where every gesture was a signal of status and moral worth, the act of smiling, or choosing not to, became its own form of social dance. To be beautiful then was not to shine, but to glow quietly. To smile, not in joy, but in composure, and to protect, above all, the illusion that even behind imperfect teeth, dignity remained untouched. In the courtly mirror of the Middle Ages, the ideal man did not mirror the chiseled muscle of mythic heroes or the rugged laborer of the fields. Instead, the most admired men walked a line between strength and subtlety, power and polish. Masculine beauty was not about domination, it was about control, of posture, of expression, of impulse. And above all, it was about appearing as though one had been born noble, not built by effort. The desirable male figure was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and a narrow waist, not unlike a Gothic arch, structured, elongated, and elegant. Muscular arms and thick legs might exist beneath fine fabrics, but they were not meant to be displayed. To be overly built was to risk being mistaken for someone who chopped wood or hauled barrels. In a world where labor was the province of the lower classes, visible strength was not a virtue. It was a liability. Instead, refinement became the mark of high birth. The nobleman glided rather than stomped. He stood straight, his movements measured, his clothing tailored to flatter his silhouette, tunics that cinched the waist, padding that emphasized the shoulders, boots that added subtle height. Posture was everything. A slouched back or drooping shoulders spoke of laziness or illness, but a straight spine and graceful gait, that was lineage made visible. Facial features, too, were carefully coded. A high forehead, a strong jawline, and a straight, symmetrical nose were signs of good breeding. Cheekbones that caught the light beneath a feathered hood, eyes that held composure, even in conflict. These traits filled the pages of romance poetry and illuminated manuscripts alike. Hair mattered. A nobleman's hair was neither wild nor neglected. It was groomed, styled, and sometimes enhanced. In many courts, shoulder-length waves were fashionable, particularly if they appeared natural, even if that meant sitting by the hearth with curling irons or applying herbal rinses to coax out the shine. Some men wore their hair parted with care, others brushed it back beneath caps or cowls, but always it had to look intentional. Facial hair, depending on region and decade, followed its own evolving script. Some courts favored smooth, shaven cheeks, a sign of youth and gentility. Others admired short, sculpted beards or mustaches, framing the face without overwhelming it. What never passed for noble was neglect. A beard left wild or patchy suggested wilderness, madness, or worse, peasantry. And while women were bound by restrictions of modesty, men had their own rules to follow. Their attractiveness was never to seem performed. They could not be seen chasing beauty. They had to embody it, effortlessly, as though born into it. The ideal man did not preen or fuss. He existed, and in his presence alone, he commanded admiration. This illusion was carefully maintained. Clothing was layered to flatter without flaunting. Colors signaled wealth and rank. Deep reds, dark blues, and rich purples. Dyes expensive and rare, wrapped around bodies in a choreography of class. Embroidery along sleeves, brooches at the collarbone, or rings glinting beneath a fur-lined cuff. Each detail whispered, "I do not work, I was born to be seen." Even the weapons of noblemen became part of the aesthetic. A sword was not just for battle. It was a symbol. Worn at the hip, it elongated the figure, added weight to the step, and suggested readiness without aggression. The ideal nobleman might lift it, but only ceremonially, or perhaps to duel for honor rather than survival. Real fighting, after all, could smudge your sleeves. To be a beautiful man in the Middle Ages was to carry the image of capability, tempered by restraint. You could look like you had strength, but only the kind that came from good blood and excellent posture, not from calloused hands. You could possess charm, but only the silent kind, expressed in glances and gestures, not in declarations. Masculine beauty was not loud, it was composed. A nobleman's allure came not from what he revealed, but from what he withheld, and in a society obsessed with status and appearances, nothing was more attractive than seeming as though you had nothing to prove. In an age when plumbing was a distant dream and hot baths were luxuries reserved for the well-connected or spiritually daring, the medieval world found other ways to manage scent. Cleanliness was not just about health or habit. It was about impression, and in the courts and cloisters of Europe, your scent could speak before you ever opened your mouth. Bathing existed, of course. People didn't live in perpetual filth, as is often imagined, but regular washing, particularly of the entire body, was complicated. Water had to be drawn, heated, and carried. Bathhouses came and went with moral approval, depending on the century and the sermons of the local clergy. At times, public bathing was embraced as a health practice. At others, it was condemned for its association with nudity, temptation, and sin. When the bathhouses closed, the body remained, and so did its odor. But where water was absent, scent stepped in. Enter the pomander, a small, decorative orb often made of gold or silver, worn on a chain or carried in hand, filled with aromatic herbs, dried flowers, and spices. Cloves, cinnamon, rosemary, myrrh, and even powdered roses were popular choices. This wasn't merely a pleasant accessory. It was a portable defense mechanism, a perfume grenade that could be discreetly raised to the nose at the first hint of discomfort, or preemptively, to make oneself more appealing. For the nobility, perfume was woven into life. Gloves were soaked in scented oils. Hair combs were dipped in rosewater or herbal vinegar. Handkerchiefs were perfumed and fluttered at the slightest breeze. Even clothes might be layered with sachets tucked between folds, linen absorbing the fragrance while protecting against sweat. But perhaps the most strategic scent layer was linen itself. The medieval wardrobe relied heavily on underlayers. A nobleman or woman might wear a fine wool or silk gown atop several layers of linen, a fabric prized for its breathability and ability to be laundered more frequently. The outer garments, heavy and expensive, were washed rarely, but the linens beneath were the secret, absorbing sweat and allowing a semblance of hygiene in a world where soap was handmade and time was precious. Some women, determined to smell like more than damp cloth and obligation, lined their bodices with lavender or mint. Others kept flower petals in their shoes, crushed beneath the weight of daily life but releasing fragrance with each step. Bed sheets were sprinkled with herbs, and some even placed aromatic branches near windows to catch the wind and refresh the air. Scent was everywhere. Not overwhelming but layered, subtle, always curated. Men were no exception. Though less decorated than their female counterparts, noblemen took care with their smell. They might anoint their beards with oils, keep sachets in their doublets, or burn incense in private chambers. A knight could not risk smelling like the battlefield in court, and a courtier, no matter how well bred, could lose favor with one badly timed breath.
Dry bathing, too, became popular in more restrained households. This was exactly what it sounded like, wiping the body down with cloth, often soaked in fragrant water or vinegar, then powdering the skin with scented dusts. It was more ritual than refreshment, but in the absence of soap and steam, it allowed the illusion of purity. The olfactory etiquette of the time was strict but unspoken. To smell offensive was not simply unpleasant. It was a sign of disorder, decay, and possibly damnation. To smell too strong, however, too exotic, too perfumed, was to risk suspicion. A balanced aroma, clean but not seductive, spiritual but not indulgent, was the goal. And in this subtle dance of fragrance, scent became power. It marked the body as cared for, the soul as ordered, and the presence as welcome. In great halls and dim chapels, on battlefields and behind veils, medieval people carried with them the invisible evidence of effort, a reminder that beauty, even when unseen, could still be smelled. In the layered theater of medieval beauty, the body was rarely seen in its true form, and that was exactly the point. Where modern ideals might value muscle tone or hourglass curves revealed by clingy fabric, the medieval world prized a different vision, one of softness, gentleness, and above all, restraint. The body, like the soul, was expected to be well managed, concealed and composed, never demanding attention. The ideal feminine figure was not robust. It wasn't athletic or even overtly sensual. Instead, it was slender, delicate, and just round enough in the right places to suggest fertility without boldness. A narrow waist was essential, but not the kind sculpted by abdominal work or strict diet. It was the illusion of fragility, of being slightly too tired to lift a pail of water, yet perfectly suited to sit at a loom or glide through a corridor with hands folded and eyes cast downward. Clothing helped. The silhouette was designed, not born. Gowns were cut to elongate the body, with waistlines placed high, often just beneath the bust, in an early form of what we now call the empire waist. This created a long, uninterrupted flow of fabric that hinted at grace and height. The fabric fell loosely over the hips, smoothing everything into gentle lines, hiding what was not ideal and emphasizing what was. There was no clinging, no clashing of skin against cloth. The effect was like a shadow or a whisper present but never bold. For those who needed help reaching the ideal, there were tightly laced girdles and fitted underdresses. These garments were not corsets in the later sense. They did not crush the ribs or deform the spine, but they did mold the torso. The goal was a controlled softness, enough curve to suggest womanhood but never so much that it threatened modesty or suggested appetite. One had to appear touchable in theory, not in practice. Being too thin, however, was also frowned upon. A body too lean could suggest sickness, famine, or spiritual corruption. Medieval life was close to starvation more often than not, and extreme thinness could be a sign not of beauty, but of misfortune. Thus, a subtle roundness in the cheeks, a softness in the hips, even a modest fullness in the chest, these were not only accepted but quietly praised. They suggested health, survivability, and the quiet luxury of enough to eat. Diet, where it was controlled, was less about quantity and more about symbolism. Beauty manuals of the time recommended fennel for digestion, rose petals for breath, wine to improve color. There were whispered suggestions about which herbs might ease bloating or make the skin glow, but these were not prescriptions for thinness. They were recipes for grace. A beautiful woman didn't starve herself. She dined lightly, modestly, and only on the right things. And movement mattered. A beautiful body did not march or leap. It did not haul or strain. It drifted. A woman might raise her hand to adjust a veil or tilt her chin to acknowledge a suitor, but she did not run, not unless it was into a burning church. Her posture was upright, her steps measured, her hands still. Beauty was not only in the shape of the body, but in how it behaved. All of this formed a kind of choreography, an art of illusion. The goal was never to show the body, but to suggest it. A woman's silhouette became a canvas for projection, purity, wealth, lineage, and restraint. What the body could actually do was irrelevant. What it appeared to be capable of, or incapable of, was everything. To be beautiful in the medieval sense was to be unburdened by the physical. You were not meant to carry, or sweat, or tire. You were to appear as though you had been sculpted by poetry and preserved by prayer, untouched by weather, labor, or time. And so the body, though hidden, spoke volumes. It whispered of class and careful breeding, of a life free from toil and excess. In its quiet elegance, it became a reflection not of desire, but of discipline, not of power, but of the artful performance of softness. Among the few parts of the face that were left untouched by powder or veil, the eyes became a theater of emotion, subtle, sacred, and immensely powerful. In medieval beauty, they were not simply organs of sight. They were instruments of suggestion, confession, and allure. They carried weight, not just through their color or size, but in how they were used or not used. The ideal medieval eye was soft, wide, and clear. It carried with it a kind of eternal awareness, as though it had seen sorrow but chose not to speak of it. Poets lavished attention on them, calling them mirrors of the soul, wells of virtue, lamps of modesty. They were never fierce, never challenging. They flickered like candlelight, steady, subdued, and always watching from beneath lowered lids. Directness was dangerous. A bold stare could imply rebellion or seduction. So women were trained to glance, to flutter, to look down at the right moment, to tilt the head slightly while raising the gaze just enough to invite curiosity, never confrontation. These were rehearsed gestures, part modesty, part mastery. The church encouraged this too. Modesty was a virtue, and the eyes, so expressive, so hard to control, were the battleground between purity and temptation. Too much blinking could be nervousness. Too little pride. The correct eyes were patient, downward-facing, lightly tear-streaked if necessary. A woman who looked too directly was sometimes called possessed. A woman who never looked up at all might be praised as saintly. But the power of the eye went beyond church halls and courtly love poems. In everyday life, the eyes became a tool of social performance. A subtle lift of the brow could silence a servant. A long blink could end a conversation. Averted gaze. Submission, held gaze, danger. In a world of strict hierarchy and narrow opportunity, a well-timed glance could be the most daring move of all. Color, again, played its role. In Northern Europe, pale eyes, blue, gray, green, were idealized, thought to suggest spiritual clarity or untouched innocence. In southern climates where dark eyes were common, their beauty was still praised, though sometimes through the lens of mystery or aristocratic lineage. The eye itself was often less important than what it seemed to reveal. Did it tell the story of a life spent in contemplation? Did it glow with virtue? Did it reflect restraint? Some tried to enhance what nature had given them: a touch of soot around the lashes, a dab of burnt cork or charcoal to darken the edges. These crude cosmetics were dangerous and unreliable, but the intention was the same: to deepen the gaze, to widen the eye, to tell a more compelling silent story. Tears were another tool. Not sobbing, that was vulgar. But the sheen of moisture at the rim of the eye could imply sensitivity, spiritual awareness, emotional depth. There were no artificial tears in those days, but staring into smoke or enduring public embarrassment could achieve the effect. And once achieved, it had its reward: admiration wrapped in concern. Even when eyes failed, when age dimmed their light or illness clouded their clarity, the memory of their power lingered. Old poems spoke not just of eyes that shone, but of eyes that once shone. A fading gaze could become the subject of nostalgia, the sign of a once radiant soul now entering quiet decline. In the end, the eyes were where the medieval woman lived most visibly. Beneath veils and silks, beyond layers of lead powder and social expectation, her gaze remained the one place where something raw, perhaps even honest, might emerge. A flicker of rebellion, a glance of longing, a look that lingered just half a second too long. It was there, in the eyes, that beauty became more than shape. It became a performance of spirit, quiet, restrained, but never unnoticed. The mouth, though small, carried vast weight in medieval society. It was where words were born, where sins were whispered, and where beauty, if not perfectly performed, could unravel. Unlike the eyes, mysterious, expressive, and often praised, the mouth was a space of caution. It could reveal too much. It could draw unwanted attention. It could betray the very image of restraint that noble beauty demanded. To be desirable was not to speak well. It was to speak wisely, or better yet sparingly. The ideal mouth was quiet, soft, and poised. It did not burst into laughter. It did not raise its voice. It did not argue. A woman's voice, like her body, was to be measured and moderate. High-pitched or loud tones were seen as vulgar, undignified, or worse, immoral. A mouth that moved too freely was a threat to the illusion of virtue. But it wasn't only about what the mouth said. It was how it looked while saying it, or even when saying nothing at all. The lips, ideally, were small, bow-shaped, and pale. Fullness, though sometimes admired in certain regions, was often linked to carnal excess. Rouge might be applied with a trembling finger, just enough to mimic a healthy flush, never enough to draw accusations of vanity. And even then, a woman would deny it. "The wind did it," she'd say, or "I've just come from prayer." The art of deflection was as crucial as the art of application, and yet the mouth remained a focal point precisely because it was dangerous. It was the gate between the private soul and the public world. It could curse or charm, gossip or confess, provoke or plead. The medieval world feared the mouth because it could not be easily controlled, and so it was often closed. A smile, as we've seen, was subtle, a mere suggestion of amusement, never a display of teeth. Laughter had its place in taverns and festivals, but at court or in religious settings it could quickly be mistaken for frivolity. And nothing was more damning for a noblewoman than appearing frivolous. A woman's beauty was supposed to radiate from within, shaped by piety and grace. The mouth, if not carefully composed, could shatter that illusion. Even in love, the mouth played a cautious role. Courtly affection was often conducted at a distance, through poetry and glance. If a lady was kissed, it was in secret, and if she smiled afterward, it was behind a fan or veil. There was an art to keeping one's lips sealed, literally and metaphorically. To be mysterious was to be magnetic. To be talkative was to be reduced. And so, noblewomen became masters of the quiet mouth. They learned to hold it still during long sermons and tense feasts. They learned to speak in low tones, to sing softly if asked, to smile without widening their lips. Their mouths became masks, gentle, composed, and impenetrable. This control extended to how mouths were portrayed in art. In medieval paintings, even the most beautiful women appear solemn. Their mouths are tight, barely curved. Saints and queens are captured mid-thought, never mid-sentence. The effect is haunting, beauty not as seduction but as silence. But the mouth was not only feared for what it might say, it was feared for what it symbolized: desire, appetite, pleasure. In religious rhetoric, the mouth was often linked with sin. It could lie, tempt, or consume. It could laugh at inappropriate times. It could eat with greed. In some, it could betray the soul. And so, controlling the mouth, suppressing its urges, softening its sounds, became an act of spiritual discipline. This fear extended into fashion. Veils, hoods, and wimples were not only meant to cover the head or hair, they framed the mouth, drew attention away from it, sometimes even partially obscured it. A woman wrapped in layers of linen spoke less and was heard less. That was often the point. And yet, for all this restraint, the mouth remained a site of intimacy. In love poems, it was called a rose. In religious texts, it became a vessel of praise. In dreams, it could still kiss, could still whisper, could still bite. And perhaps that is what made it so compelling. It was the most controlled, yet the most dangerous part of the face. To be beautiful in the medieval world was to manage contradiction. The mouth embodied that contradiction perfectly. It was sacred and sinful, soft and sharp, delicate and dangerous. It was a line that had to be walked with precision. Every day, in every moment, a tightrope of expression, silence, and expectation. So the next time you look at a medieval portrait and wonder why no one smiles, remember, the mouth wasn't just a feature. It was a force. And in the world of medieval beauty, the most powerful thing a woman could do with her mouth was nothing at all.